And Christine for reminding me.
For reminding you to remind me. It really does take a village, folks. I believe that to be very true. And by the way, I pushed up all of yesterday's videos. So those are live. You can see the links in the wiki under lesson recordings if you want to check out what we did yesterday. So give me a thumbs up in Slack. I'll put a little prompt in here. Give me a thumbs up if you, once you have your app open to the state that we left it yesterday, so we can move forward. And let me know if you need any assistance getting it up and running and such. There we go.
Me and Alan were wondering about this actually. In class we did all like the express parts of it.
Yeah.
And then for homework we didn't, which is kind of the right way to do it.
Well, there isn't a right or wrong way. Angular doesn't require a backend to serve it. So remember, Angular is all front end. So to do some HTTP stuff, you'd want to run it like on Python simple server. You'd want some sort of basic server running. But since Angular is all front end, you could literally just cd into this public folder and run the front end off of the public folder. The reason that the examples I'm showing you and that we'll show you going forward, the reason that we're putting Angular in a Node Express app is because that's what your project 3 is going to need to be. So we want to give you good examples so there aren't any excuses on not being able to figure that stuff out. Because project 3 is going to be the full mean stack. And that's essentially, today with our $sign HTTP, we'll be building a full mean stack application. So outside of using authentication, it'll pretty much be like 90% of what will be required, maybe 85–90% of what will be required for your project 3. But yeah, that's a really good point. So Angular, again, you could get Angular up and running with an index.html and one JavaScript file, like at a bare minimum. But if you want to do some more complex stuff, you do need a server to run it. And actually, yesterday, you remember when I sent you guys that BitBalloon link? Let me send that again. So I sent you guys a link of a deployed version of this janky app. And we're going to put some more on top of this. This isn't the full thing, but so this BitBalloon link, the reason I deployed this to BitBalloon, well, one was because I was lazy, but you can do the same thing. If you want to deploy the app we're working on to BitBalloon, the only thing you need to do is drag that public folder that we created. Just drag it to BitBalloon. That's all that you need to deploy this app. Because BitBalloon is its own, backend service and such. Now, if we wanted to add a database and some more complexity, we'd probably want to actually push this to Heroku. But all you need is an index.html and throw some Angular in there, and you're good to go at a minimum. But you guys are more advanced than that. All right, we have 6 thumbs ups, so let's wait for one more, and we will move forward. And actually, truth be told, so the lesson that we're going to go over this afternoon was actually much more complex. It was actually 2 different apps that we were going to be working on, the back-end app and then the front-end app. It was 2 completely separate apps. You were going to have 2 completely separate servers running at the same time. But I actually stripped it down a little bit, so we're only going to use 1 app this afternoon. So hopefully that'll be a little clearer as we're learning Angular. But your project 4, which is going to be using the Ruby on Rails API with an Angular front end, for that project, you are going to have 1 Rails app that's just the backend component without any views. And you're going to host that app on Heroku. And then you're going to build an Angular Express Node Express app that's going to ping your Rails app for the database component. So you're actually going to have to build 2 apps that talk to each other for Project 4, which is pretty slick. All right, cool. So we have 8 thumbs ups. Sweet. Let us move forward. We don't have too much more to wrap this up, but wanted to talk about filters. I know that you guys got a taste of filters last night in the homework, I do believe. Angular filters. So these are just some common ones. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but Angular filters format a value from within the view. So you can certainly format your data in the controller itself, but when using Angular, it's best practice to manipulate your data as far as filters go. Just do that in the view. So for example, if you wanted something capitalized, if you wanted to have a currency filter so that you have like a $ with decimals and such, generally speaking, it's better to do that using a filter. So Angular filters are just for presentation purposes, and it doesn't alter the data, right? It just take this value and make it look like currency. So put a $ and maybe like a decimal with 2 spaces, that kind of thing. So don't format data within the model or controller. It's best to let these Angular filters manage that. And here's some examples of some very simple filters. So and we'll take a look at these. I'll pop these into my app. Can you guys still see my screen and stuff? Okay, cool. So let's take a look at this first one, and you guys can follow along if you want to put these into your app as well. So one is this pipe uppercase. So there's an uppercase and a lowercase. So just to see how this would work, let's go down to where we're doing our LIs. So maybe right here, where I'm printing out each to-do.task. Let's say that I wanted each to-do to be uppercase. So the really quick and dirty way to do that, all these filters require a pipe. So I would put a pipe there and then use the uppercase filter. And if I go over here and refresh, then all of my to-dos have been, uppercase has been applied to them. Let's say that if I wanted to have all of these to-dos truncated to maybe 8 characters, there's this number 2, the second filter. There's also, for example, a limit to filter, and it's camel cased. So let's say that I wanted to limit all of my to-dos to 8 characters. Maybe I'm making a mobile app and I just don't have that much real estate to show the entirety of the to-do. Or actually, maybe I want to click on the to-do and it'll open up like all the details or something. That'd be a nice little UI thing to do. But yeah, let me refresh that. And there we go. So I took out the uppercase filter, and now I'm kind of truncating the strings so that only 8 characters are showing. So that's a limit to, for example. Let's take a look at a product price currency. I don't even know. Actually, you guys can play around with that later because I don't even have any like numerical values in this app right now. But you guys can play around with that later. So if you wanted to format something as money, you could do that pipe and then the currency filter for Angular, and that'll put the $ and it'll move it over 2 decimal places, for example. And then there's also this date format. So I don't have date in the app, so we'll just skip that one. But if you look there in the screenshot, for example, that is how you could format a date. And if you look in their documentation, there's a lot of different varieties of how you can make your date formatted. So maybe you just want, month, day, year. Maybe you want month, day, year with the hour, minute, seconds, things like that. So you have a lot of configuration you can do with that. But there's a date filter with Angular to format your dates. And then this last one, number 5, this order by is kind of cool. So let's say that you wanted to order your to-dos maybe alphabetically, or in reverse alphabetical order. Or if we were time stamping our to-dos, maybe you want to sort your to-dos by the most recent at the top, or maybe the oldest at the top, however you want to do that. But let's take a look at this order by filter, for example. So I'll get rid of this. Just let me refresh and get it back to where it was. Cool. So let's check out this order by. So for this one, since we're trying to order all of our LIs, for this particular filter, we would need to put the filter on the actual ng repeat element. So for this one, we'd want to put it on our opening li tag where we have that ng repeat. And so what we could do is inside that ng repeat, we can put our fancy pipe there, and we can add the order by filter. And then with single ticks, because this needs to be a string, we can do negative task. So this is actually going to do it in reverse alphabetical order. So if I save that and refresh, so it's going to take each task and do it in reverse alphabetical order. And that's why we have that little negative task there. If I took that off, it would do it in, ABC order, the correct way. And you can see B, G, P, T, A, C, T, A, K, etc. So that's an example of order by. So these are just 5 examples, kind of the low-hanging fruit of Angular filters, but there's a lot of really handy, helpful ones if you go to the documentation. But this is how, generally speaking, how you would implement them. They all require a pipe, and then the filter argument would be after that. So any questions about filters? It's a lot more handy than writing a lot of JavaScript code to sort your to-dos, on the back end, or configure a date timestamp or something. These are really convenient. Okie dokie. Well, let's move forward. Yesterday, we spent a lot of time talking about Angular directives. So can someone come on mic, or if you want to put it into Slack, in your own words, what is an Angular directive? Just to recap what we covered yesterday. Maybe what is, go ahead.
So I think if I remember correctly, it's the ng/ that tells you exactly what you want the Angular to do in that scenario.
Yeah, nice. So pretty much anytime you see an ng dash, that's going to be an Angular directive. So yeah, Angular directives, they're fancy. You can consider them attributes that we put on an HTML tag that gives us some sort of behavior. So examples of the ones that we looked at yesterday, actually just put those into Slack. What are some of the directives that we used yesterday? And even last night in homework, any that you guys used? I can think of like probably 5 off the top of my head that we touched on yesterday. ng-click, yep, absolutely. So ng-click is just like using a vanilla JavaScript on-click. It's just the Angular-esque way to do it. ng-repeat, yep, ng-controller. Perfect. What's the most important directive? Like the first one we need to add to make sure our app actually works in the first place. ng-app, yeah, very nice. And then what's the one that we used? The prime directive, that's right. The most important one. What's the directive that we used to hide the Angular to-do, and we can see the typing? What was the directive we used to hide that P element? Yeah, ngF, perfect. Yeah, so those are like 5 that we went over yesterday. We're about to take a quick peek at, I think maybe 5 more. And this is, again, not an exhaustive list. Just want to hit some of the greatest hits, some of the most popular ones that you guys will be using. So let's walk through this next section. And I'm going to send you guys some code so that we can just take a look. So you don't have to do this out longhand necessarily. So I'll put in the screenshot, and then let me send you the actual code so you can copy it. So let's look at some more examples of Angular directives. And to do this, we're going to add a new controller called matey controller to our to-dos controller JS file. Now, best practice would be to put your controllers in different files, but just for this example, to keep it simple, we're just going to add it to the file that already exists. So don't worry about that. But here's the code that we're going to use. And then I'll show you how we can throw this into our to-dos controller. So here's some code. So let me show you how we can add this. So if we go to our to-dos controller file, it's right down here. Move my index down to the bottom. So if we wanted to, again, best practice would be to separate your controllers into separate files. Just for this janky exercise, to save us some time, we're going to put it in our existing file. But if you want to, you can chain these controllers together. So what you can do is right after this to-dos controller declaration, take off that semicolon at the end, and just like jQuery or .then chaining promises together, on the next line we can do a .controller, and then let's create a matey controller, and I'll keep it all capitalized so it's consistent with the lesson. And so we're going to name this controller matey controller, and then we're going to declare another function, a matey controller function that we'll pass in as an argument. And so for the actual function, no worries if you just want to copy this code. So I'm going to copy the matey controller function, and the order isn't super important here. I'm just going to put the matey controller like right underneath, just so we can read all this better. So again, my to-dos controller is down here. If you want to paste that matey controller function, below the controller declaration. Again, the order isn't that important. I'm just putting it at the top just so we can see things a little more clearly. And then let me send you some HTML that we'll add to see these in action. And then we'll just walk through them and kind of talk about what they're going to give us. So here's a screenshot to add some CSS and HTML to our index.html. So that's the screenshot. And let me just hard copy the code if you want to copy it. So I'm not going to create a separate CSS file for this example. We're going to create one CSS rule for a class, for a red class. So if you want to grab that style, those style tags, and in index.html, let's just dump those here in the head, just in the interest of time. So we're going to see how we can add and remove CSS classes, CSS rules using Angular. So we'll just dump that style class up there. And then let me send you the HTML that we want to paste in there as well, so we can see how this stuff works. So here's some code to add to the body. And you can see the little comment I put in there. So let's add this code to the body below all of the to-dos code. Again, the order doesn't really matter. I'm just trying to stack this stuff for readability purposes. So let's scroll down to the bottom, and right underneath, like our ngIf, this p tag, if you just want to dump it in there, so we'll know to look here at the bottom to take a look at our directive examples. So again, I just pasted that code just inside the closing body tag, just at the bottom of our HTML. And now if I refresh, and we're going to walk through all these. But if you see a janky Captain Jack Sparrow, then you're in good shape. So give me a thumbs up in Slack. I can see Jack Sparrow. So just want to make sure we have that code, and then we'll walk through these examples. And I'm going to stretch my browser out, stretch it down a little bit so we can see it. So give me a thumbs up once that's working. Okay, we got 6 thumbs ups. Cool. Okay, so let's move forward. So here's an explanation of the directives that I just wanted to, kind of make you smart about. So the first one is ng-bind. This is a pretty common one. So ng-bind binds the contents of the element to whatever is specified. ng-bind, it kind of does the same thing as the double curlies. And you can see number 2 there. So the double curlies, same as ng-bind, but it's not an attribute. So ng-bind is actually an attribute that we put inside the element itself. The curlies, if we want to display some data, we would put inside the opening and closing tags of the given element. Now, there's certain reasons maybe you want to use ng-bind over the curlies, but for our purposes, they're pretty much the same. It's just a way to display data. But as we get into more complex Angular functionality, there's things like custom directives. So you can create your own directives. You can create your own Angular components. These are more current ways to use Angular. For these newer kind of features in Angular, you would probably want to use an ng-bind. But I just want to show you what ng-bind does because it's certainly a handy directive. So ng-bind, if we go to our control, well, let's take a look at our index.html. So if you look at this div ng-bind, it's the first div inside of our kind of opening ng controller div. So just as an example of ng-bind, to this empty, just generic div, I'm ng-binding matey.hello. And if we look in our matey controller, our matey controller hello is just heyo matey, exclamation point, exclamation point. So notice when you use ng-bind, see there isn't anything in between the elements. We add ng-bind as an attribute, and Angular automatically inserts that data in between the closing and opening and closing element tags that you put the ng-bind on. So right here we can see heyo matey right there. And keep in mind, I could have done this as well. So I could have done, I could do matey hello. So it's the same result. So we see we get the same result. It's just 2 different ways to bind data to the view. So you can use the opening, the 2 opening and 2 closing curlies to insert some data in between the tags, or you can use this ng-bind attribute. And again, for what we're doing, either one is fine. As we get into more complex concepts in Angular, you're probably going to want to use ng-bind. Going to want to rely on that. But ng-bind is a pretty common one. Number 3, so you guys covered number 3 last night, which is awesome. So ng-click is a super common one, super common Angular directive. It's the same as the onClick attribute, the kind of vanilla JavaScript onClick attribute that you would put on an element as an attribute, inside the element tag. So the example that I gave you guys here, if you go down to this button, this awesome button that says click me, I put an ng-click. So when this button's clicked, it's going to hit matey.makeAlert function. So you can probably guess what this janky thing is going to do. So it's going to hit matey.makeAlert. And if we go up here to our matey controller, makeAlert is just an anonymous function that's going to alert hello world. So pretty exciting stuff here. And so to see this in action, if I click on this button, I get that hello world. So pretty exciting. We could have done the same thing with the generic onClick event handler, but this would be, obviously there's better uses for this than an alert, but this would be the Angular directive way to add a click event if you're going to use Angular in your front end. ng-click. Any questions about ng-bind or ng-click? Number 4, ng-class. This is a pretty cool one. So ng-class binds the class of an element to the result of an expression. Kind of the same concept as ng-if. So remember that ng-if, it was based on either a condition or an expression was truthy or falsy. It's the same thing with ng class. So ng class binds the class of an element to the result of an expression if it's truthy or falsy. So an expression is just some code that gets evaluated. So in this example that I gave you guys, if we look on this div right here, we'll take a look at ng show next. But I put an ng class attribute. And can someone take a look at this code, the ng class directive, and tell me what this is going to do? What is this code doing for us? And I'll put it into Slack. So someone wants to put it into Slack, or if you want to come on mic. So what is this doing?
I think that if the value of show div, it's a truthy value, then it would maybe turn it red. I mean, it is turning red, but I don't know what red.
Yeah, that's great. So more specifically, it's adding the class of red to that element. Yeah, so this is the syntax. So ng class, it takes an object, and we created this red class. Remember, we put this in the janky style tags up here. So we have .red, so the class, and that class is going to make the background color red. But specifically, we're using this class rule to be specific, the class selector. Yeah, so I'm going to add the class of red to this element if matey.showDiv is truthy. And it just so happens that here in my controller, showDiv equals true. And so we know that's true. Now what's going to happen if I make matey.hideDiv? Because hideDiv equals false right now. So let's see what will happen if I do that. So it turns off that class because hideDiv is false. Yeah, so that's how class works. So you can get, I mean, this is a pretty simple expression, but you can do things like, you know, in unit 2, maybe if, you know, if the current user is logged in, so if the current user exists, right, which would mean the current user is true, maybe you wanted to put some sort of styling on an element or change the navbar in some way. So you can use those truthy and falsy expressions to add and remove classes like that. So it's a pretty cool directive. Or maybe if you're doing like tic-tac-toe, maybe if you were using Angular, maybe once you click, you know, if the box you click is X, then add, you know, an X class that makes the thing have an X in it and makes it a different color or something. So you can use ng class for things like that. The next one, ng repeat. I don't think we really need to go through that one. We saw that yesterday. So ng repeat is a great way to loop over a collection. Ng if, we looked at that yesterday. Ng show and hide, number 7 there. So this is a really good one. So show and hide is like ng if, but it hides the given DOM node or DOM element using display : none, but it doesn't remove it from the DOM completely. So remember ng if, we looked at that yesterday, and if you go into the inspect element, you don't even see the DOM, you don't even see the element at all, because unless it evaluates to true, it's not even going to build it in the DOM to save time. But ng if, excuse me, ng show and ng hide is just going to do that display none and display block. So it's not quite as invasive. So to see an example of that, let me refresh here. So for this one, we have, right here, we have a div with an ng hide. And here we have an ng show. And the ng hide is matey.hideDiv. Ng show is matey.showDiv. So it's kind of like the yin and the yang. So with ng hide, it's going to hide an element if this evaluates to true. So if you want to hide something, it needs to evaluate to true to actually hide it. And so I know it's a little confusing, but in this example, hide div, I set to false, which means it isn't going to hide it. But if ng hide is actually true, so let's change that to true. And then this hide main div should disappear when I refresh. So there we go. So I'm hiding that div because this evaluates to true. And I'll switch that back. So ng show, again, is kind of the opposite. So show maybe dot show div is true. So it's going to actually show that div. If ng show evaluates to false, then it will not show it. So ng hide and ng show, a little bit of the yin and the yang. So let me change that show div to false. And then if I refresh here, the red show me should disappear. And there we go. So it's no longer showing it. And if you inspect the element, yep, go ahead.
Yeah, when we were earlier, we were trying to play around with show and div. So I kind of curious how would be best practices, I guess, in using them together if you wanted it to be like hide something this moment, show something this moment.
Yeah, well, I'll go back to that navbar example. So let's say that you have a current user. So if the current user is logged in, maybe you want to show the log out button and you want to hide the sign up and log in buttons in your nav. But if the current user doesn't exist, meaning the current user is logged out, then maybe you do want to show the sign up and log in buttons and you want to hide the log out button. So it really just depends on how you want to set it up. I mean, you could use ng show for both of those, right? And then if the current user is false or true, it would, toggle them on and off appropriately. But that's like the first thing that comes to mind. Or maybe you have, maybe you have like a blog article that takes up a lot of real estate. And so maybe you just want to give them a preview of like the first paragraph of the blog article. If they want to read more, they could click a button that would show the rest of it. And then maybe if you click the button again, it'll hide it, something like that. Yeah, it just depends on the use case for it, how you want to use it rather.
Yeah, the examples weren't being very helpful, at least for me, because I get what you're saying, but I think it's because I know we were thinking about like trying to do something with like a mouse over, so like to make the image show only in certain places. And it says something like when you use show it, and even if you don't assign the class hide to it, it automatically assigns the class hide to it because it needs to show something that you hid. And then it got a little weird around there.
Was that in the homework or code school or something?
Oh, this morning during the morning exercise, we were working, trying to do a little thing with the image. And so we looked that up in the Angular documentation, and that got a little confusing right there.
Okay. Can you show me that later? I'd have to take a look at it to fully grasp it, but I'm happy to walk through that later if you want.
Yeah, I think it makes sense, like you said it. I think it's just I was trying to like understand what they meant about that whole like adding the high class to it part.
Yeah, well, let's check that out. Let me go into the, so remember yesterday I showed you guys what I think is kind of nerdy and cool, is that Angular is actually adding a lot of extra classes and such to your elements. So let's see if it's adding those ng hides and such. So if we go down here to our ng controller area, well, I don't really see anything that important down here. So we just have our ng hide attribute. Yeah, I don't see anything super fancy here. But you can see that our ng hide is display block. And then if I change that to false, so our hide div, well, if I change it to true rather, so it hides it, then this is going to be display none when I refresh. So if I refresh here, and then if we go to that same one, well, so it changed it. So now Angular kicks in, it's doing ng hide, and then it's doing none, and it's using that bang important, which means this rule, this property, this value takes precedence over anything else. So remember, the bang important is like the nuclear option for CSS. We don't really want to use it. But Angular can manage that stuff as it wants to. But
I think that's what I was talking about right there too, because it says right there, the NG hide not, and it shows something similar to that. So maybe that's what I was trying to explain.
Yeah. Like I said, if you want to walk through like a specific example, I'm happy to take a look at that from the morning exercise. We can talk about that later. Yeah. The final directive to take a look at here that I just want to point out is ng source. So this is really handy, particularly for image tags. So if you want to do some sort of Angular logic for an image, sometimes this is a really handy directive to use. And it looks like this. Well, let me show you in the code. So if you guys look down to this image tag, so you could totally just use like, src and then hard code the image link if you wanted. But if you wanted to use Angular, so maybe if you're cycling through different images or something, if you want to get some data from a controller, ng source would be the way to do that. So I'm using ng src, and this equals, within quotes, matey.image source. And so my .image source is just like wherever I found Captain Jack on Google. But this is a really good one. So let's say that you, each time you load the page, maybe you have an array of like 4 different images, or some sort of modal, and maybe it's on a timer. And so you want to hit the controller to figure out which image link for the image that you want to display at any given time. Then you'd probably want to use like an ng source attribute directive. So you can plug that in like so. So those are a couple of the greatest hits. Any questions about those directives? There's certainly a lot more if you go through the documentation, but I think these are like the kind of the main ones that'll get you through your project 3 if you're interested in implementing these. But any questions about those? And they all have ng dash in common, so that should be not too crazy to recognize a directive when you see one.
I missed if you did something to get the red div to show up. Mine never, been trying to play around with it and I never got that part.
To get the red div to show up, or to get the red background to show up on it?
That. To make it red. Because I have that
Sure.
red matey show div, but did you have to edit anything from what you pasted in Slack?
No, the code that I pasted in Slack should make this render red automatically with that code. But the idea is that it's using this ng dash class. So I'm going to apply the class of red if whatever's after this colon evaluates to true. And so it just so happens that matey.showDiv is the Boolean true here. We could probably just put in true here, like straight up. That should work. So we could do it that way as well if it's a little simpler. And I just named it the class red to keep it simple. But the idea is if this is false, if it evaluates to false, then it is not going to apply that red class. And then the red class, we just created a dummy class and those style tags for that. So yeah, so it's just an example of how you can toggle classes on and off if you want, using ng class. Something that just, like maybe you want to create a class so when a to-do is completed, or maybe you want to hit a checkbox next to the completed to-dos and maybe it strikes it out, or maybe it changes it to a different color. Maybe you have a class that you want to add to that attribute when you click on it. So maybe you could use like an ng class for that. So if completed equals, so if completed is true for that to do, then add this class that makes it like grayed out or italicized or something. So that may be a use case for ng class. Is that, does that answer your question?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
I just need to play around with it more.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of this stuff you just have to, you just have to tinker with it. But you guys will have a lot of good practice to do that. All right. So the last thing I just wanted to show you guys an example of is nested controllers. The reason I'm mentioning nested controllers, you may not even use them in your projects, but I just want to kind of give you a heads up of what nested controllers are, because we're going to be using a version of nested controllers to manage our authentication for project 3. So this isn't something that you have to like commit to memory. It's not even something that you necessarily have to use in your projects. I just want you to see an example of what a nested controller is. And then if you have a situation where this would be helpful in your project, maybe you could use a nested controller to solve your problem. So let me slack out some code and we'll just take a look at what a nested controller looks like. So I'll just paste in the screenshot and then I'll give you guys the code itself to take a look at. And then we will hop on to $HTTP. So again, we're going to add 2 more controllers just for this example, and we'll put this in our to-dos controller file just to keep things simple. So what I want you guys to do is, if you're in your to-dos controller, go up here, get rid of that semicolon, and then we're going to add 2 more controllers. So remember, we can chain these together, which is pretty sweet. So for this example, let's create a parent controller. And we'll create a parent controller function. And then let's also create a child controller. So hopefully these are good and semantic names. Cool. And then down here, I'm just going to put it right underneath so it's easier to read. And just like the code that I slacked you, let's declare a parent controller. And I'm going to create one property just called property1 equals fun. And then down here, let's declare that child controller. And we'll also give child controller a property1, and we'll make this awesome. So kind of the key to this demo is that we want to have a property, 2 properties that are named the same thing. So we can see how this nested controller, how the controller knows which property that it's actually trying to grab. It's kind of the point of this example. So yeah, so go ahead and create those 2 controllers. And then you can just copy this HTML code if you want. I'll put this into Slack and we'll walk through it. And there's several different ways to implement this nested controller feature. Like I said, I'm just showing you kind of a simple example just so you've heard of it, because sometimes this pops up. Like I said, we're going to use a form of nested controllers for authentication, but Colin's going to show us a slightly different way to accomplish the same thing when we talk about authentication with Angular. So I just wanted to just kind of give you a preliminary heads up on what nested controllers are. So if you want to copy that HTML code, and we'll just put this at the bottom of our index.html. So just go ahead and make some space. Again, just for readability more than anything. And I just dumped that, right inside the closing body tag. And if you refresh the browser, let me make this, hopefully you guys can see this. So right down here, this is what we want to look at, this :fun and awesome :fun. Let's talk about what's getting rendered. So give me a quick thumbs up in Slack once you are able to render that in your browser. Just want to make sure you guys got everything set up correctly. Four thumbs ups. By the way, Karen, how's that? Did you get your 5K monitor wired up?
It's pretty sweet.
I can't imagine, because like I said, I finally got this 4K and it's so crisp. I can't imagine a 5K, how much crisper it could be. It's pretty amazing. Can you like see the future or something? Is it that crisp? All right, 5 thumbs up.
I had to put you guys on the low res, back on the low res screen. That's how.
Oh, you did. Like, whoa, that's too much detail. I don't need that much high def. That's funny. All right, we'll wait for another thumbs up or two, and then we'll walk through this example. Okay, cool, 7 thumbs ups. So again, just want to show you guys a brief example of a nested controller. So let's take a look in the index.html first. Let's see what we've set up here in our markup. So we have one kind of outer div, and we're attaching the ng controller, the parent controller, to that outer div. So we'll consider that the parent. Inside of that div, we have a span. So we're going to print out the properties. And then down here, we have another nested div. We would consider this a nested controller. So we have this child controller, and it's nested inside the parent controller. So the point of this is to see, can the parent controller see the child stuff? Can the child controller see outside itself to see the parent stuff? You know, how does that nesting work? Things like this are really good. Perhaps if you wanted to have some sort of main controller, let's say on your body, the body of your page, and maybe that main controller manages your navbar information, or maybe it manages like your current user. It would manage information that maybe you want to show on any view, any controller could have access to it, that kind of thing. And so that's one reason that nested controllers may be a good approach. But here we have this parent controller. And if we look at what's rendered in the view, let's take a look at this span tag. So this span tag is outside of the child controller, but it's inside the parent controller. And what I want you guys to see is that this first line, notice that child.property is not rendering. So the idea is that the parent controller cannot see the properties of the child. So you can't see inside of a controller in that manner. But the parent can see its own property, obviously, because we have parent.property, which is fun. So that's printing out. So a parent can't see down inside of the child. However, down here, if we go inside the child controller div, notice that we're seeing the child property of awesome. And the child can also see the parent property one, which is fun. So the nested controller, the child controller can see up. It can see out into that outer scope, but this parent controller can't see into the child controller scope. So I just wanted to give you guys that example. And again, one reason that you may want to use this technique, we're gonna see a way to do this using authentication, but you know, something like this, if you have some sort of main controller that you would put on your body that would maintain all of the data that you would want any other controller to use and have access to. You know, maybe you'd want to have a main control on the body and then have nested controllers inside the body for whatever portion of the page you wanted to manage, things like that. But this is just a simple example of a nested controller. And the big idea is that the parent controller can't see inside the nested controller, but the nested controller can see outside into the parent controller. So just a simple example. Any questions about that? Is that uber confusing or?
Other than the names, what did you do to make it a child?
The only thing, so notice that this parent controller, if I close the parent controller, I have a parent controller div. And inside that div, I've nested another controller, this child controller.
So it's all in the index. It's not in the controller side.
Well, we created the controllers in this controller file. You know, the parent
Right,
controller.
right.
Yeah.
I mean the parent-child relationship is only in the index.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
It's just how we set up the HTML. So we put a div with the child controller inside of that parent controller div. So that's the only thing that we did. And again, you may not even have a use for this in your projects and such, but I just wanted to throw this out there because we are going to talk about it when we talk about authentication for your project 3. So just this idea of nesting. Just wanted you guys to have seen an example of it. And we'll talk more about this in the next few days, but yeah. So that's nested controllers. Any questions about what we've covered? So again, like yesterday afternoon and today, we talked about directives, we talked about filters, and then we just saw an example of Angular's nested controllers. So any questions about anything that we've covered? Okay, so let's move forward with $HTTP. So we're going to work on like a full stack application with a database and a backend, the whole thing. So let's take a 10-minute break. Let me get set up for that, and we'll come back and hop into our $HTTP lesson. So we'll come back at 12:35.